In my essay, which was focused around the artificial and Parker's back, I set out to analyze how the main character from both stories, those being Mr. Head from the artificial and Parker from Parker's back, lost their control and their perceived feelings of their way being the right way throughout their respective stories. This question came to me because as we were reading Flannery O'Connor's short stories and noticing themes throughout them, like the recurring moment of violence that leads to a potential change in a character in a handful of stories, a theme that I noticed is that a lot of characters had so much perceived control at the beginning of their stories, only to lose it at the end. Some examples being Mr. Fortune in A View of the Woods, Old Dudley from The Geranium, the grandmother in A Good Man is Hard to Find, and Holga from Good Country People. These being examples that could be used with this thesis that I didn't cover. In addition to stories with examples of these characters losing control in my essay, I tried to see if there was a potential beneficial way for them to become a better character as a result of their loss of control. For addressing my argument, my thesis was that the gradual deterioration of these characters' control eventually give them the path to becoming a better person. A main roadblock in this thesis is that it relies on identifying what happens after the story ends, but a concrete fact in displaying the loss of control in the characters is shown in the story. So basically, I sort of tried to interpret if the characters could possibly be redeemed at the end and become a better person after they lost their control. As I also did my written essay, I'll cover Mr. Head first. At the beginning of the story, there are a multitude of key passages that serve as the starting point of Mr. Head's control. On page 249, these passages state that, quote, "The straight chair against the wall looked still and attentive, as if it were waiting for an order," and he saw half of the moon 5 feet away in his shaving mirror, paused as if it were waiting for his permission to enter. In another scene, Mr. Head and Nelson are at the train stop, and the time comes for the train to arrive. For a brief moment, the train doesn't come. This is Mr. Head's first brief instance without control over the situation. Another point of the absence of Mr. Head's control and lack of knowledge about the city are him previously getting off at the wrong stop at the train station, and his continuous circular path in the city. Mr. Head loses more control once Nelson figures out that they've been walking in circles, and he loses even more control when he and Nelson, in an attempt to diverge from their current path, get lost yet again in a predominantly black neighborhood, a group of people Mr. Head claims to hate. After all of these instances, the ultimate loss of Mr. Head's control of his son, his surroundings, and himself comes when Nelson, who has been left alone by Mr. Head in an attempt to, in a way, make him undergo a trial of him surviving alone in the city, runs to find Mr. Head and to collide with an old woman, in which Mr. Head approaches the scene and, when asked about Nelson, says, "This is not my boy." This is the moment of physical and verbal violence in the story, and the moment Mr. Head loses all control. In the other story I covered, Parker's Back, Parker initially loses control of his relationship with his wife, Sarah Ruth, because she isn't particularly happy with his tattoos. He decides to set out to get a tattoo of, quote, God, so he can please his devout wife. This backfires on him when he gets a tattoo of God, quote, with hypnotic eyes on the back that gain control over him. He goes back to his wife to show her his tattoo, only for her to tell him that you can't perceive what gods look like, and this is particularly sacrilegious. This breaks Parker physically and mentally, and he loses control as she beats him.